You're watching This Week in Louisiana Politics with Fred Childers.
And I think the Attorney General ought to take a deep breath and just calm down a little bit and get back to doing his job.
There you have it. Governor John Bel Edwards and Attorney General Jeff Landry exchanged some sharp criticism over a federal lawsuit that challenges the state's death penalty. We'll break it all down for you. We have a jam-packed show for you. Hello, I'm Fred Childers. Thanks for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics on your local election headquarters. We have a lot of controversy to tell you about. Louisiana Attorney General Jeff Landry is accusing the governor of refusing to enforce the state's death penalty law. At the center of this controversy is a federal case called Hoffman versus Jindal, in which the multi-drug execution procedure used by Louisiana is being challenged as unconstitutional. So alternative drugs have been sought. But the AG says he'll no longer represent the Department of Corrections in that case. The reason? Landry says it's because the DOC recently filed a motion in federal court voluntarily agreeing to stay and delay executions for another year. Here's part of the AG's letter to the governor. He writes, in part, "In light of your administration's latest decision to not pursue justice for victims and their families and to unnecessarily tie the DOC's hands by ceding control to a federal court, I have directed DOJ attorneys to withdraw from further representing the DOC in this case. My decision does not come lightly or without exhaustive efforts to get your administration to work with our team to bring our state's most monstrous criminals to justice," end quote. Now, I spoke with the Solicitor General who filed the motion to facilitate that removal. Here's what she said about the federal case they no longer want to be a part of.
The litigation provides basically an excuse for the administration to not move forward. Like we saw just this week, when you go into federal court and you voluntarily agree to a stay that lasts an entire year again and again and again, and then you say we can't do it because of a federal court order, you've created a self-fulfilling order.
General's office has been representing Louisiana's
Now,
Governor
Governor
John Bel Edwards called the AG's actions political grandstanding. Now, we caught up with the governor the day after he got the letter, or he says he never got it, but he heard about it from the media. Here's what he said about the alternative drugs that could be used for lethal injection.
Statutorily prescribed manner of death, and we have certain drugs that we have to use, and they are absolutely not available. And that's through no fault of his and no fault of mine. It just happens to be the case. And so why he did what he did yesterday, you will have to ask him. It makes absolutely no sense to me.
Now, the governor also criticized Landry for involving the crime victims in his argument. Landry told the governor the biggest obstacle to getting justice for victims' families is the governor himself. Now, despite the governor's insistence that no one is to blame, he is still getting the blame for executions not happening in Louisiana. Murder victims' families say the executions need to start again. Dion Guillory has one family's fight for justice.
Fondest memory of your daughter?
Oh, her smile.
The biggest smile you've ever seen.
Carol and Wayne Gazzardo described their daughter Stephanie. They haven't seen this smile in person since 1995. Their daughter was one of two people murdered by Todd Wessinger, who now sits on death row.
It's just the most horrible feeling.
He's a thug. He's a coward. And I want to be there and watch him when they stick it to him.
Despite getting a death penalty, that won't happen anytime soon. Governor Edwards and the Department of Corrections filed a stay delaying all executions for another year, citing the drugs used in the procedure were deemed unconstitutional. Secretary LeBlanc said in a statement, numerous pharmaceutical companies have again refused to sell DOC any of the drug compounds needed to carry out the execution. DOC also explored the options of using a compound pharmacist, but this option was fruitless due to the lack of privacy protections and the inability to remain anonymous. With all this death penalty drug drama turning another page, the Gazzardo's daughter's murderer lives another day.
Where are our rights? Where are my rights? Where's my husband's rights? My family's rights? Where's my daughter's rights?
The buck stopped with you, John Bell. And that's all I got to say from that. I've said enough. I don't want to get too carried away, but I'm pissed.
The Gazzardos want the governor to contact them to talk about this. They say the plan is to keep fighting for their daughter and won't stop until her murderer is executed. For your local election headquarters, I'm Dion Guillory.
All right, thank you, Dion. An execution hasn't been carried out in Louisiana since 2010. According to the AG's office, 73 inmates are on death row in Louisiana. Coming up next, we're talking to a pollster about the increase in Democratic voters heading to the polls and what that means for midterm elections in Louisiana. That's next on your local election headquarters. Welcome back to This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm joined by John Cuvion with JMC Analytics and Polling. Welcome, John.
Welcome. Good to be here today.
Well, you know, you've talked about, we've seen your research for months now where you're talking about somewhat of well, I guess more enthusiasm from the Democratic voters. And we expect that to play a role in the upcoming midterm elections. We expect more Democratic voters to turn out. Can you quantify that enthusiasm for us?
Yes, so what I've seen, I've been following the primaries that have occurred. Thus far, 30 states have conducted primaries ever since March. And what I've seen in those primaries is that Democratic turnout relative to the 2014 primary is up 79%, whereas Republican turnout is only up 18%. So that's a huge differential in party enthusiasm.
Yeah, that's big. Is there, so if you dial it back and you really look at the big picture, you're saying in your research that there's a big difference between party enthusiasm and actual number of registrations. Are
Correct.
Fewer people registering to be Democrats?
Yes, and what's happening, which is kind of interesting, you do have the party enthusiasm, which is based on actual primaries, which have been conducted in 30 states. The other thing which you mentioned, which is voter registration, I've been looking at the changes in voter registration ever since Donald Trump was inaugurated back in January of 2017. Since that starting point, what I have seen is that there are 1 million less registered Democratic voters, 500,000 less registered Republicans, and about 500,000 more independents. So I would say the argument from the standpoint of voter registration is that people are becoming more de-aligned. And this is looking at 93 million voters total. So even though it's truly a small part of the whole, the fact is you are seeing declining registration in the major parties.
Yeah, I think I saw some of the numbers you put in your research was a million less.
Correct.
A million fewer Democrats, 500,000 fewer Republicans. They're all switching over to independents.
Independent, yes.
So we're not necessarily losing them, like the actual people, but they're just switching.
Right. I would say it's a combination of partisan de-alignment, number one, and number two, since these are really off years as opposed to a presidential election year, you have people who get purged from the voter rolls, and traditionally you don't have large changes in the voter rolls unless you're talking about the presidential election years. Midterm election years are not quite as exciting as, say, 2016 or 2020 will or would be.
With that enthusiasm in mind, do you think Democrats could take back Congress?
I do, yes.
Yeah, it's both Senate and the House of Representatives?
The House, I would say more than a 50% chance. The Senate, I would say it's kind of hovering around the 50% chance. Just because you have several weak Republican seats and you don't have that many vulnerable Democrats, even though numerically twice as many Democrats are up for re-election than there are Republicans.
Yeah, Louisiana is a solid red state, so any chance that it would turn blue or lose Republican seats?
So the irony is, here in Louisiana, where we tend to go against the national trend, I don't think the Republicans have anything to worry about, but with the upsurge in Democratic enthusiasm, I can see a scenario where after candidate qualifying has concluded next week, that all 5 Republican incumbents, or close to all 5 of them, will have Democratic opponents.
Fantastic. Well, we will definitely see come November 6th how Democrats turn out and Republicans as well.
Yes, and actually we're kind of in a lull right now where there's no primaries going on. We do have some wrap-ups in Alabama and Georgia over the next couple of weeks, party runoffs. In August, everything returns with a vengeance, and we go through a roughly 6-week sprint for those remaining 20 states that have not yet held primaries. Then, of course, in Louisiana, we finish up on Election Day and have a December runoff.
And a lot of times it feels like a sprint or a marathon.
Yes, it does.
All right, thank you, John. Good insight. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more This Week in Louisiana Politics.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. Well, it may soon cost Louisiana less money to borrow from out of state. This after the Moody's credit rating agency changed the state's bond rating to stable earlier this month. But the state's treasurer insists the journey to a stronger outlook has barely begun. Capitol correspondent Harrison Golden caught up with Treasurer John Schroeder on Monday as he gave an update to Louisiana's fiscal condition.
We've had the gun cocked and held to our heads. Now the hammer's not cocked anymore, but they're still holding the gun.
Treasurer John Schroeder tells the Press Club of Baton Rouge that extending 0.45 of the expiring fifth penny of sales tax may have settled this year's chain of sessions, but the debate over Louisiana's spending priorities is not over yet.
And we'll burn through this cash quicker than you can blink. Don't pat each other on the back. We really didn't fix anything other than raise a lot of money.
The renewed rate is expected to bring some $463 million through next June, less than what the previous fifth penny had raised. It will stay on the books through 2025. That buys time for lawmakers to debate some more long-term structural reforms after such efforts over the past 2 years foundered.
Now they're going to have 7 years to look at it. And you want to bet how long it's going to take them to do it? 6 years and 360 days.
Lawmakers will have a chance during next year's regular session to look at changing tax codes and spending control measures, but whether any such recommendations will pass through the Capitol during what will be a major election year for Louisiana remains unknown. Schroeder argues what happens in November shouldn't matter during the springtime session.
The dollar bill does not have a D or an R stamped on it. It all spends the same way. I learned in first grade that 1 + 1 is 2, and if you spent 2, you were broke.
For your local election headquarters, I'm Harrison Golden.
Now, Schroeder also weighing in on a new development from the Tax Foundation. Louisiana no longer has the highest sales tax rate in the nation. That superlative now goes to Tennessee by 0.01%. The treasurer hopes that'll mean less bad PR for the state, as he put it, even if it is by a sliver. More than 8 years after the largest oil spill in history, settlement funds from the Deepwater Horizon disaster will be used to renovate some of Louisiana's most prized natural destinations. Capitol correspondent Harrison Golden shows us where the money will go.
Fish anywhere, but you catch fish in Louisiana.
The state often called the sportsman's paradise, catching a deal of its own. $60 million will go toward fishing piers, state park trails, boardwalks, and other recreational projects across Louisiana.
That sportsman's paradise is not just a catchphrase. That is who we are. That is what we are. That's what drives so much of our tourism, which is great, but it's really about our quality of life, our way of life as well.
The 23 projects in all will spread across 9 parishes along Louisiana's coast, areas hit hard by the 2010 Deepwater Horizon oil spill. This money comes not from taxpayer dollars, but from the state's settlement with BP following that disaster.
During that oil spill, Louisiana beaches and fishing areas were closed, recreational fishing access was limited, and camping and other recreational uses were diminished because of extensive oiling and cleanup activities.
Under the settlement, the dollars must go toward recreational projects. State officials hope that investment will draw tourists back to Louisiana's coast to camp, boat, and fish.
This is another case of Louisiana being smart about taking a bad situation and improving the well-being for our citizens.
The Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority ultimately chose the projects with public input. Residents gave officials more than 300 ideas, from which the state narrowed down the list.
There's a lot of need out there, but we felt like we selected those projects that have the most impact, the most value, and bring the best services we could to the state.
Exactly when all of these projects and improvements will open remains unknown, but coastal officials say some of the construction will begin by the end of summer. In Baton Rouge, Harrison Golden.
Well, it was back to the farms on Thursday for Governor John Bel Edwards and our state's agriculture chief. They spent the morning in Plaquemine, speaking one-on-one with farmers there. Capitol correspondent Harrison Golden runs down the issues they shared.
This is where the dollars begin, right out there in that dirt. That's the foundation and the structure of the economy.
Agriculture Commissioner Mike Strain and Governor John Bel Edwards on the road again, hearing from dozens of farmers with varied concerns about the industry.
From an industry perspective, it's not like it used to be 40 years ago. We've got some challenges that we face every day. For example, transportation.
Farmers on hand say the aging roads are delaying how they receive their supplies and send their goods. The governor urging lawmakers to raise the state's gas tax, which hasn't changed since 1989, in order to fund repairs and build new roads and bridges.
We have bridges all over the state of Louisiana that were built by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And so we're going to have to figure out, how do we move forward?
Meantime, farmers also concerned with the Trump administration's tariffs, as exports account for more than $8 billion of Louisiana's $13 billion agriculture economy.
And so as we move forward, we hope we can get the issue with the tariffs resolved, before November. That's kind of the goal.
With soybeans, aluminum, and steel at the center of these tariffs, the governor pressing the White House to put these to an end.
The price of steel could increase the cost of some projects here by 20% or more. And so I just wanted to make sure that we brought that to the president's attention.
This marks a continuation of last year's farm-to-farm tour the governor and Commissioner Strain took, and they say they're open to more listening sessions throughout the coming year. For your local election headquarters, I'm Harrison Golden.
Now, farmers also voiced concerns on immigration, saying recent crackdowns have left their land without enough temporary workers. The governor and Commissioner Strain are calling on the White House to expand availability of visas for those seasonal laborers, many of whom come through Mexico for work. Homeowners impacted by the 2016 flooding have more time to take advantage of the temporary housing program now. That's the mobile housing units utilized by flood victims who couldn't find temporary housing. On Friday, Governor John Bel Edwards announced that FEMA approved an extension for the program through January 15th, 2019. Governor Edwards says the number of people relying on temporary housing is declining, but families are still trying to recover. In fact, 595 homeowners and 19 renters are still occupying those units. In all, 4,500 households across 16 different parishes were provided temporary housing units. Governor Edwards says the extension is necessary considering the overwhelming challenges victims of the flood have endured. Up next, two congressmen from Texas, a Republican and a Democrat, had to endure a 1,600-mile road trip to D.C. in the same car. A novel thing happened. Find out what next on your local election headquarters.
This is your local election headquarters.
Well, who knew that bipartisanship could be achieved in a car on a road trip from Texas to Washington? Well, that's exactly what happened when two U.S. congressmen from Texas had no other way to get to the Capitol so they could vote. They documented their adventures for social media, of course, and they won an award for displaying civility. Here's Anna Wernicke.
We've got a long way to go and a short time to get there.
It was the start of an unlikely friendship. One Republican and one Democrat crammed together in a Chevy Impala for 1,600 miles.
When Beto suggested we go on this trip, he never thought I'd say yes.
Texas Congressman Will Hurd and Beto O'Rourke live-streamed their 36-hour road trip from Texas to Washington last March after a snowstorm canceled their flights.
Our goal is to get to Washington, D.C. before votes tomorrow.
Their bipartisan cross-country road trip caught the attention of millions of people who followed along as they talked about everything from music to immigration.
Just so you know, the bipartisan bridge we just crossed, Will just shared his password on his iPhone for me so that I can check into Google Maps.
We actually weren't a Republican or a Democrat. We were just two dudes trying to get to work.
And on Tuesday, Hurd and O'Rourke reunited, once again sitting side by side to receive the Civility in Public Life Award for showing that even in the most divisive times, Congress can still come together.
To have these unguarded conversations about health care, about the investigation into Russia's hacking of our election system was really inspiring to me.
O'Rourke pointed to President Donald Trump's remarks after meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Finland as evidence that there is a growing need for civility and bipartisanship. And he praised his Republican colleague and co-pilot for speaking out against the president.
Hey, everybody, we made it.
Hurd joked that next time he hopes it doesn't take 36 hours in a car for two politicians of rival parties to find common ground.
That's bipartisanship right there.
In Washington, I'm Anna Wernicke.
Who knew a road trip could ease tensions? I bet that Whataburger helped too. That would certainly make me happy. Well, thank you for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm Fred Childers. I'll see you next Sunday right here on your local election headquarters.